So everybody, this is the legalization panel, and I will basically hand it off from here. And we're hopefully bringing Catherine online very shortly.
Thank you very much, Connor. So welcome to legalization. I'd like to introduce Sam and Mitchell, and starting with you, Sam, if you'd just like to give the audience a very brief introduction, and we'll move on to the debate in a second.
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Sam Chapman. I use he, him pronouns. I was the campaign manager for Measure 109, also known as the psilocybin therapy measure here in Oregon. I've been working in progressive drug policy for a little over 12 years now, from medical cannabis advocacy to local policy, and now the future of psilocybin therapy and expanded psychedelics across the country. Happy to be here.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sam. Mitchell, over to you.
Good evening or good afternoon, depending on where everybody is. My name is Mitchell Ozak. I'm a strategy and operational consultant. I've spent the last 6 years consulting to the legal cannabis industry, starting in Canada and then being taken around the world to South America, Africa, and the EU. And in the past year, I've focused a big chunk of my time on the burgeoning psychedelics industry, and I'm looking forward to weighing in with this august panel of experts.
Thank you very much. So let's start with some basics. So Sam, just kind of to ground the discussion, what is your view of the difference between decriminalization and legalization, and why is it important that there is a distinction between the two?
Yeah, it's a great question. And, I would say decriminalization really is a focus on the social justice and racial justice aspect, right? For anyone who's familiar with cannabis is very familiar with the fact that people of color disproportionately are targeted for drug possession. And that's had a massive impact on communities of color, all negative. And so we really saw the emergence of cannabis legalization as a really big opportunity to take a first big chip away at a pillar of prohibition, which was cannabis, right? We've started to see that and expand that into psychedelics as well. We don't see the same type of disproportionate arrest rates for psychedelics just because there's not as many people getting arrested, but that does not mean that they are not still targeted and that there are not still multiple negative outcomes that happen on a daily basis, regardless of who you are or where you are. So the decriminalization aspect is incredibly important to ensure that people are not going to jail, right? I personally believe that, we all have the right to put what we want in our bodies. And if we're going to do that, we should be educated. And I think that the laws and removing the criminalization of drug use is a huge, massive step in that direction. On the other end of the spectrum, we have legalization, which I think probably has 6 or 7 different chapters that we could go into. But overall, I think the legalization as we know it today is kind of the adult use retail sale legalization, right? And I think that there's probably going to be a lot of healthy discussion as to whether or not that, the space that cannabis operates now in a lot of places is the right, wrong, or hybrid model for what the future of psychedelics may be. And then there's a middle ground, which I think is often termed as the medicalization of psychedelics. I prefer to call it the therapeutic route of psychedelics, because it takes some of what exists in the medical realm today and applies it to psychedelic research and science and applications. But, here in Oregon, I'm sure we'll get into this more, it's really a lot more of a therapeutic program. And there's a lot of reasons why we believe that the therapeutic route, above and beyond a straight prescription model, only stands to benefit more people who do not necessarily have a qualifying condition, but stand to benefit from safely accessing psilocybin therapy. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the whole spectrum, from decriminalization to adult use retail sales to a medical therapeutic model in the middle.
So if we look at that as a sort of pyramid of decriminalization, the base is decriminalize. So take the stigma, take the criminal penalty off it. The stage above that is medical access that is fully legal. That's the therapeutic model. And at the top of the pyramid, you've got full legalization, which would include recreational use. In fact, if I wanted to go, to the moon with psychedelics or fish with them, that top bracket is complete legalization. So we've really got three kind of layers to this discussion. And just over to you now, Mitchell. For an operating company, so from an investor's standpoint, is it true that decriminalization has no impact on investors, and what they're looking for is some form of legalization to give them a regulatory framework to operate in? And I'm not talking here about drug discovery companies. That's outside. Those are using existing. We're talking about people that might want to set up a retail mushroom company or operate an ayahuasca retreat or a dimethyltryptamine clinic. Is it the case that legalization is necessary for businesses and for investors into those businesses to operate?
Well, just building on, the answer is maybe. So building off of what Sam said, decriminalization is the fundamental pillar by which everything else is built off of. You can't have legalization without decriminalization. So if you're an optimist, of which I am one, and you start to see decriminalization in certain regions or markets, that's a positive sign for investors, as well as a positive sign for operators. The question then becomes, where do you go from decriminalization, and what does legalization mean? So Sam outlined, a bunch of steps to get to that point, but the reality is there's a lot of in-between steps there. And if you follow the cannabis industry in terms of its migration, in Canada, for example, you had in 2001, you had medical cannabis being allowed to be accessed by Health Canada. You only got adult use legalization in 2018. So it took 17 years to go from medical accessibility to flower availability. And then around edibles, that didn't happen until 2019. So there are a lot of steps between decriminalization, early access, and then markets evolving. For investors, particularly for savvy investors and institutions, they're going to look very carefully about what licensing and what does legalization mean at what point in the value chain. So right now, you're allowed to do a lot of research, and a lot of companies like Compass and Cybos and so on and so forth are pouring a lot of money into research-based legalization. But that isn't what necessarily we're envisioning when we talk about nootropics, nutraceuticals, or some sort of adult use. That's much farther down the road. And that is not going to be attracting investors because they don't have a clear path to when that legalization will occur. My own opinion is I don't see it happening in Canada, at least, in terms of the medicalization of psychedelics for at least 2 years from now, at least 2 years, if not much longer than that. So there's a lot of distance. There's a lot of evolution between something that's legal to conduct R&D on and then legal to do processing, analytical testing, clinics in North America and so on and so forth. We're a ways away from that, but it'll come, and I'm optimistic about that.
I agree that it doesn't become particularly interesting for investors until you are further down the track, because that research is actually something that you're investing into with a very low possibility of a return. What you want is a more open market where you can generate revenue. So I agree we've got a long way to go. Now, putting Oregon in context, Sam, gazing into your crystal ball, if you followed the kind of patterns that have happened in cannabis, do you think it's ever likely that you'd have federal legislation that allowed for, say, therapeutic use of psychedelics? We'll come back to recreational and full legalization. If we just focus for the moment on therapeutics, is that something that you see on the horizon, or do you see this evolving on a state by state basis?
I don't think it's a dichotomy. I think it's both. And I think that we have therapeutic models at the federal level now. They're just not specific. I mean, psilocybin is still a Schedule 1, right? All these psychedelics are still scheduled to some degree, but the research is happening, right? And so I think that these things can work in parallel. What I want to push back on is this notion that the trajectory and timeline is even comparable to cannabis. I actually disagree. I don't think it is at all. I think that the fact that Oregon just passed decriminalization of all drugs and simultaneously also passed, and on a separate measure, the first ever psilocybin therapy program, I actually think we just showed the country and the world that you can do both of these things simultaneously. You just have to treat them on their own merits. And that's what we saw here in Oregon was we did not combine the campaigns. We may see combined campaigns in the future, right? But I do think that, while the FDA process and the state process can go hand in hand, and we very much expect to work with the FDA here in Oregon and looking at, all the different regulations and protocols at Johns Hopkins, NYU, et cetera. But, if I were an investor, I'd be looking at the future of market share. You don't have to have research, additional research established to acquire licensure here in Oregon, right? The new market share is going to emerge from a state by state basis. It's not going to emerge nearly as quickly from a patentable, synthetic FDA model. Like, how many people are in those trials? A couple of hundred? How many people are suffering from anxiety and depression that are not even diagnosed, here in Oregon or across the country? If I was an investor, I'd be paying close attention to the state level races and being able to look at those as new market share. Right here in Oregon, we also just accelerated the trajectory by not requiring any pre-existing conditions in order to qualify for psilocybin therapy. If you're over the age of 21 and you are not contraindicated, which means that you can show that you can safely access psilocybin therapy, you will be able to have access. We just threw out the qualifying condition model that existed in medical cannabis. And that's why I don't think that there are some comparables always, but I think I always stay far away from a timeline trajectory. I think that we're on a much faster trajectory now that we've passed this here in Oregon. We're going to see at least 4 to 6 other states go for it in 2022 in an off-year presidential election and probably win, on top of the fact that we are in, a pandemic, right? A pandemic that causes, stress, anxiety, and depression at unprecedented rates. The CDC says 1 in 3 Americans are now experiencing symptoms of depression and anxiety. And to not be able to not have a qualifying condition that's required for that, that's a huge opportunity for everyone. People who are looking to get into the industry and people who are looking to access those services.
Thank you, Sam. We've just out of the ether, Catherine has appeared. Could you just give us a very quick introduction, and I'm going to throw a question straight at you.
Sure. Thanks so much. Technological hazards. Yeah, my name is Catherine Tucker. I'm with Emerge Law Group. I was really pleased to work with Sam and others on the campaign. My task was to bring in the voices of the end-of-life care community because, of course, many of the studies reflect the efficacy of psilocybin in relief of anxiety and depression in terminal illness. So I was really pleased to bring those voices forward. They're very powerful stories. And I'm also working on other advocacy elsewhere in the country to remove barriers to access for that particular population, patients with serious advanced illness. And one of the interesting and exciting strategies we are deploying up in Seattle in Washington State is to apply state and federal right to try laws to psilocybin, which has not been done before, and which we think is a way to open access soon for that population.
Thank you. So here's the question.